Who is known as the poet of the piano? Is it Elton John, Thelonious Monk, Ray Charles? It's none of these. The person who's gone down in history as the poet of the piano is Frédéric Chopin. Now, I chose Chopin a couple months ago because I had heard one of his nocturnes, something I hadn't heard for a long time, and just loved it. So I bought a whole packet of CDs and then just dove into finding out more about Chopin. Even today, people in all walks of life find enjoyment, feel emotion when they listen to Chopin. If you haven't heard of Chopin, I'm going to play you something a little bit later on that I think that you will recognize. He lived only 39 years, from 1810 to 49, and had a life full of interesting people and places, and there were a few things that were just very, very important to him that stood out. His native country, Poland, his relationships, and his music. Chopin was born in Poland in 1810. When he was just a few months old, his family moved to Warsaw, which was then called the Duchy of Warsaw. Throughout his lifespan, there was just a lot of turmoil in Poland and all of Europe, really, that changed even boundaries of countries. In 1830, with all the turmoil, Chopin decided finally that he was going to leave his beloved country and become an exile in Paris, where many other notables and aristocrats also went after they emigrated from Poland and other countries. He gave his final concert then, and he went into exile. But on the way, one of his teachers, as a young person, got together a male choir, small male choir, and met him at the city gates. They sang him a cantata, and he exhorted him, asking him to remember his motherland and to keep its harmonies in his soul wherever it was that he might go. Well, when he was in Paris, he became well known and he met many well known musicians, artists of all sorts. He also stayed close to his Polish roots and went to a club that Zamoyski, the author of the book Chopin, Prince of the Romantics, said that there were old generals and scruffy young poets. Well, the scruffy young poets, of course, is because this is the Romantic era. And the poets and artists of all kinds would congregate in a place like Paris. He gave to many Polish causes, but that never really translated itself into a political activism or putting that political activism into his music. Chopin was somebody who needed friends around him all the time. He didn't like to be left alone very much. And so I want to take a look at the women and then the men in his life. Early on, he had met a woman, a nice Polish girl, that he wanted to marry. But after he finally got up the gumption after a couple years, she said yes, but Mom wasn't so quick to say yes. He was living in Paris at the time, and maybe she just figured that this wasn't the kind of person after living in Paris that was going to come home, write his music, and be content to live in Poland. In 1836, his paths crossed with that of George Sand, and nothing much happened of note. But in 1838, their paths crossed again, and they fell in love and began a 10-year relationship. George Sand, whose name really was Aurora Dupin, was a female French novelist who wore trousers. That was scandalous in those days, and her affairs were as well known as her novels. She was one of those who was in the midst of the Romantic movement. Now, the two of them were artists, so they each had to have their own space to work, and they did, and they had a lot of good times and good travels and friends in common. But it was also during this time where Chopin became increasingly ill. She became his nurse as well as a companion. There's a picture that was probably um, done thinking of him right before their breakup. Their breakup happened after 10 years during a domestic dispute where she charged that Chopin was taking the side of her daughter in this dispute rather than her. And this really precipitated, the end of everything. There's a lot of speculation as to what exactly happened, but they were never together again. Although he was able, through letters, to keep a relationship up with her daughter. Now, his music was paramount in his life. He preferred a Pleyel piano and was very particular in his piano. Wherever it was that he moved, he wanted to make sure that this piano, no matter how much it cost, came into his living space so that he could play on that. He only gave 30 large concerts in his life, only 30. Most of what he did were in smaller gatherings, in smaller arenas, or even in people's homes and drawing rooms and such like that. And something I found very interesting that you may also is that he was a master of improvisation. He would spend hours, and people absolutely loved it, sitting at a piano in someone's home and play until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, just improvising on his own or improvising on somebody else's work. And people just absolutely loved it. There's a picture of Chopin when he was in his younger years, and Chopin probably a year or so, a picture, a photograph before he passed. The love of country of Poland did find its way into his music through what they call polonaises and mazurkas. But I also wanted to play this for you because this is something that is called the Sonata Number 2 in B flat minor. I think you may have heard this. So you may have thought that you didn't know Chopin, but you do. People in today's world love to play and listen to his music. One pianist, Jean-Francois Antonioli, said in the journal Fanfare that sometimes Chopin in his music speaks Polish and sometimes he speaks French because, of course, he has both those bloods in him. In an interesting newspaper article from 1960, Archer Rubinstein, the great pianist, said that at first he gave Chopin no account. Even his teachers didn't have him play until he heard a 19-year-old playing Chopin. And he said he knew that this is how Chopin should be played. And it was part of his repertoire thereafter. Chopin is a fascinating figure that looms large still on our music scene. We've taken just a brief look at his lifelong love of his country, Poland, his relationships, which were so important to him, and his music, which gives pleasure and fills our hearts and souls even today.